Industrialization and the Gilded Age. Today you will learn how the United States became one of the world's leading industrial powers. New inventions and the organizing skills of America's great entrepreneurs vastly increased the country's industrial capacity. The spread of railroad lines and telegraph wires helped lead to the emergence of a national market. Industrial workers, ill-treated and poorly paid, began organizing into unions to obtain better working conditions. American industrialization proceeded at a rapid pace in the decades after the Civil War. Some historians consider this period America's second industrial revolution. New inventions and the technologies helped fuel the great economic expansion of the late 19th century. Please write this essential question at the top of your page. How did industrialization bring both positive and negative changes? Technological innovations. The application of electricity was one of the period's most significant developments. For its first commercial use, electricity was used as a means of communication along telegraph wires. In 1876, Alexander Graham Bell, an educator of the deaf, invented the telephone. The telephone and telegraph allowed people to communicate across great distances. In 1879, Thomas Edison combined the right kind of inert gas and glowing metal filament to produce the first effective electric light bulb. Electricity also ran motors, which started to be used to drive the machinery in factories. By 1900, electricity was also being used to power an increasing number of other types of machines, including electric streetcars and subway trains. Each new technological innovation had a dramatic effect on raising people's standard of living, as well as on the nation's economy. The growth of railroads. After the war, separate crews of engineers and laborers worked from California eastward and from the middle of the country westward to lay the track they had cut through the high mountains of the Sierra Nevada. Many of the laborers working on the Transcontinental Railroad on the California side were Chinese immigrants. These immigrants received just $26 to $35 a month for a 12-hour day, 6-day work week, and they even had to provide their own food in tents. The two halves of the first Transcontinental Railroad were finally connected in 1869 at Promontory Point, Utah. The journey from coast to coast was instantly reduced from several months to just a few weeks. The impact of population growth. In the late 19th century, the United States experienced continuous population growth in nearly every part of the nation. Between 1850 and 1900, the population more than tripled. In 1850, there were 23 million Americans. By 1900, there were 76 million. This large population increase was fueled by a high birth rate and a constant stream of European immigrants. Population growth created favorable conditions for business expansion. There was a steadily rising demand for goods and a plentiful supply of cheap labor to make them. But the growing population also made increasing demands on the natural environment, using up resources. The rise of entrepreneurs. An entrepreneur is a person who starts a business in the hope of making a profit. In the 1870s, entrepreneurs began to exercise a dominant influence on American economic life. Through the efficiencies of large-scale production, these individual entrepreneurs lowered the prices of goods, making them more affordable, while also improving their quality. These entrepreneurs were also able to reap huge profits for themselves, creating immense wealth. Because of their lavish lifestyles, the period from 1865 to 1900 became known as the Gilded Age. Some observers considered these entrepreneurs captains of industry, because they forged the modern industrial economy. Their critics called them robber barons because of the ruthless tactics they used to destroy competition and to keep their workers' wages low. Two of the most successful entrepreneurs in this era were Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller. Carnegie worked his way up from a penniless Scottish immigrant to one of America's richest and most powerful men. After the Civil War, Carnegie invested in ironworks and built a steel mill in Pittsburgh, selling iron and steel to railroad companies for tracks. With his profits, he bought other steel mills and founded the Carnegie Steel Corporation in 1892. His steel mills undercut the competition. He bought iron ore fields, coal mines, and ships so he could mine his own iron ore and ship it to his steel mills in Pennsylvania. Carnegie paid his workers low wages and forced them to work 12-hour-long shifts while he crushed attempts by his workers to form labor unions. Carnegie spent his later life in acts of philanthropy, giving away $350 million to build libraries and endow universities. Carnegie also wrote The Gospel of Wealth, where he answered critics who attacked him for paying low wages while using his wealth to build libraries and universities. John D. Rockefeller made his fortune in the oil industry. Rockefeller formed the Standard Oil Company in 1870, and by 1879, his company controlled 90% of the oil refining in the United States. By 1882, his company became a trust, in which he controlled the largest portion of shares. By 1911, the government forced Rockefeller to dissolve Standard Oil, which was divided into 20 smaller companies. Despite the breakup, the leaders of Standard Oil remained the main shareholders of all the new companies. Like Carnegie, Rockefeller gave millions of his fortune away to education and science. Big business. In 1873, America experienced a small depression. Large producers like Carnegie and Rockefeller began driving smaller companies out of business or purchasing them. In some cases, rival companies reached agreements to consolidate. Many producers hoped to eliminate competition by establishing a monopoly. Monopoly power allowed a manufacturer to dictate prices to consumers. The pros and cons. The pros of big business. 1. Large business are more efficient, leading to lower prices. 2. They can hire large numbers of workers. 3. They can produce goods in large quantities. And 4. They have the resources to support expensive research and invent new items. The cons of big business. 1. They have an unfair competitive advantage against smaller businesses. 2. They sometimes exploit workers. 3. They are less concerned with where they do business and tend to be more polluting. And 4. They have an unfair influence over government policies affecting them. New laws. At first, the government did little to regulate big business. Government leaders believed in laissez-faire, the theory that the government should not interfere in the operation of the free market. Of course, even under a laissez-faire system, government had a role in the economy. It provides laws to protect property and enforce contracts. It establishes a system of patents to promote individual inventions and enacts tariffs to help manufacturers. Some of the anti-competitive practices of business were so glaring that reformers called for legislation to remedy them, giving government an even greater role. The Interstate Commerce Act was passed in 1887. Railroads sometimes charged local farmers more to haul their crops over short distances than they charged for large companies to ship goods longer distances on more competitive national routes. Some states passed laws prohibiting this practice, but the U.S. Supreme Court held that these laws to be unconstitutional. The court ruled that only Congress had the power to regulate interstate commerce. In response, Congress passed the Interstate Commerce Act. This federal law prohibited unfair practices by railroads, such as charging higher rates for shorter routes. A special regulatory commission, the Interstate Commerce Commission, was established to enforce this act. This was a landmark measure since it was the first time that Congress stepped in to regulate business in America. Shortly after, the Sherman Antitrust Act was passed in 1890. The purpose of this federal law was to stop monopolies engaging in unfair practices that prevented fair competition. The act marked a significant change in the attitude of Congress toward the abuses of big business. The conditions of labor. One important factor behind America's astonishing economic growth in the late 19th century was the increasing exploitation of its industrial workers. The average workday and work week were long by today's standards, 10 to 14 hours a day for 6 days a week. Employers hired the least expensive laborers. Pay averaged from $3 to $12 weekly, but immigrants were often willing to work for far less. Women and children were also frequently employed as low-paid workers. As factories and workplaces grew larger, workers lost all personal contact with their employers. Jobs were offered on a take-it-or-leave-it basis. As industrialists sought to achieve greater speed and efficiency, each worker became nothing more than a human cog in a vast machine. Work became less skilled, more repetitive, monotonous, and boring. Industrial working conditions in the late 19th century were also often extremely hazardous. Safeguards around machinery were inadequate. Thousands of workers were injured or killed in industrial accidents each year. Child labor. Textile mills and coal mines made use of child labor to perform special tasks. Machinery was rarely fenced off, and children were often exposed to the moving parts of machines while they worked. Children might be used to move, clean, or fix large machines since they were small enough to fit between the parts. Injuries to children were high in many factories. About 1/5 of all American children under the age of 15 worked outside of the home in 1910. These children missed sunshine, fresh air, play, and the chance to improve their lives by attending school. Growth of labor unions. With the rise of big business, individual workers lost all bargaining power with their employers. Since most work was unskilled, workers could easily be replaced. Employers dictated pay and working conditions. Some workers formed unions in order to act as a group instead of as individuals. Unions organized strikes and other forms of protest to obtain better working conditions. The Knights of Labor, formed in 1869, hoped to create a single national union by joining together all skilled and unskilled workers. The Knights demanded an 8-hour workday, higher wages, and safety codes in factories. They opposed child labor and supported equal pay for women. They also supported restrictions on immigration since they saw immigrants as competitors for their jobs. The Knights proved to be too loosely organized. Skilled workers resented being in the same union as unskilled laborers. After losing a series of major strikes, the Knights of Labor fell apart. The American Federation of Labor, or AFL, was founded in 1881 by Samuel Gompers. Gompers hoped to create a powerful union by uniting workers with similar economic interests. Unlike the Knights of Labor, the AFL consisted of separate unions of skilled workers which had joined together into a federation. The participating craft unions limited their memberships to skilled workers such as carpenters and cigar makers. Gompers limited his goals to winning economic improvement for workers, higher pay, an 8-hour workday, and better working conditions. The AFL quickly emerged as the principal voice of organized labor. However, the AFL was weakened by its continuing exclusion of unskilled workers who made up the bulk of the labor force. As late as 1910, less than 5% of American workers were unionized. Government's attitude toward unions. Government leaders were critical of the early labor movement. In the late 19th century, most government leaders favored business and opposed unions for 3 reasons. 1. The greater influence of business. Business leaders often contributed heavily to political campaign funds. Many politicians shared the same outlook as business leaders. They believed that successful businesses were responsible for American prosperity and saw worker demands as greedy. 2. Protector of the economy. More than 20,000 strikes involving more than 6 million workers took place between 1880 and 1900. Government leaders feared the disruptive effect of these strikes on the American economy. And 3. Public opinion. Public opinion also supported laissez-faire policies. Many Americans believed that businesses should have the right to hire and fire employees as they pleased. Many were hostile to unions because they feared workers' wage demands would lead to higher prices. Union activities were often associated with violence and radical ideas.